I handed out a sheet, which some of you, sits before some of you. I'm happy to see that, which talks about a number of issues related to model formulation. Questions that you should be asking yourself about an agent-based model to help shape it, to help make sure that it's capturing the full set of considerations you may want to bring to the table. So in the model formulation stage, we're going to be specifying the model increasingly precisely in terms of its details. In terms of state charts, what do state chart transitions depend on? We saw state charts last time, but when we deal with them at the qualitative mapping stage, we're often abstracting over the details of what fires in a transition. What leads to a transition being firing? Is it a fixed amount of time you're in a state? Is it a fixed chance per unit time of transition to the next state, or does it depend on how long you've been in that state? Does it rise, for example, with the amount of time you've been in that state? These transitions need to start to be increasingly precisely specified in the model formulation stage. And by the end of that stage, they should be fixed down, okay, what are my assumptions going to be about state transitions or about flows? So in the formulation stage in system dynamics, we're specifying how do flows depend on the stocks of our model. Ultimately, it's the stocks. They typically depend more on intermediate variables on the way, and that in turn depend on other stocks. So here we need to do the same thing, and then there's a set of things called observer processes. These are the outputs we're interested in from the model. They're the things we want to collect on which we wish to collect data. So we have this rich model with perhaps multiple populations in it. What do we want to look at from that model? What do we want to gain insight into? What do we want to save away as data in a database? What do we want to look at in terms of graphs or tables? We typically have a set of observer processes within our model that are quite different from what we have in system dynamics. In system dynamics, what do we typically go in with a stock and flow model? What do we typically go and look at to see changes over time? What are we looking at in graphs, for example, or tables? We're looking at what? So if I'm in Benson and I'm interested in how my model is operating, I'll call up a graph, and typically it's a graph of what? Stock. Yeah, it's a graph of a variable in the model, right? It could be a stock, it could be a flow, it could be an auxiliary variable that's the sum of several stocks, what have you. Now, in an agent-based context, you typically are going to be having a set of outputs that you're interested in that are going to be aggregations. Not always, but they're typically going to aggregate over different subcomponents in the model. And generally speaking, you're not going to have a ready-made variable that captures that for you. So the process itself is going to gather data, perhaps in different subsets of the population. Maybe, for example, in all diagnosed diabetics, you're going to go out there and look through the population, and we'll see how to do this in great detail in one of the next few lectures. And it will count the number of people out there in the population who are diagnosed diabetics. And it will then allow you to report that. Or maybe the observer process is keeping track of the number of people who have been infected with TB, over the course of the past year. It's not as easy here as just going and clicking on a flow, flow number of infections per year, and just viewing it. Instead, we often have processes that we have to kind of describe that will go out and collect that information for us. So delineating these is important. Asking ourselves, what do we want to observe and how are we going to collect that information? And then we're going to have to think about what's our source of model parameter values. Where are we getting these from? We're going to talk about that more and many of these things more in specific lectures, but I wanted to give this overview so you can situate particular topics within the modeling process.